Chapter 1, Greenlight by Serena Musifer. Sena Khan stared at the small house situated amongst the jagged rocks, in disbelief, her hands trembling as she held a letter of invitation firmly. The stone house opened to a set of wooden stairs that led through a patch of trees down to the beach. The cool mountain wind brushed against her temples, and Sena forced herself to let go of the letter with one hand so she could shove her hair back out of her eyes. It had taken her an entire week to locate the house, based on the flimsy instructions she'd been given. It was as though the location had purposely been secured by a Fidelis charm. She could hardly believe that she'd made it, let alone what she'd come to do. She just started her reporting career, a fledgling of just 3 months, as they called the new recruits at the headquarters of the Daily Prophet, when she had been called into Barnaby Cuff's office. She trembled just as hard then as she was now. She was convinced that they were going to let her go. The little articles that she wrote hardly ever gathered an audience, and she knew that the editors had noticed because she had gotten fewer assignments for the last few months. She knew writing about hazardous workplace environment of the Owry at Gringotts, or her particular favorite piece of the Centaurs' unionizing efforts at Hogwarts, wasn't particularly favored at the office. But it was an honest work that she believed the rest of the Wizarding Britain needed to know more about. But clearly it had been the last straw. They were going to let her go. After all, no fledgling who made it to Cuff's office came out smiling. She tried her best to prepare herself for the news, but it was hard to do anything when the worst news of her life was right behind the door. She didn't think there was anything worse than getting a taste of what could have been before having it taken away. She forced herself to think of what her Aunt Hera had once told her. One of the strongest women I ever met told me that when you're afraid, you take the second step. It doesn't have to be grand. It doesn't have to be visible, because that step is powerful. You take the second step and you know then that you can survive anything. And so she had knocked on the glass door and stepped into Cuff's office. "You are invited to write a piece on Draco Malfoy," Cuff had said the moment she entered from where he stood behind the grand mahogany desk. He hadn't looked up at her. What? "A letter arrived this morning from Miss Pansy Parkinson, saying that Mr. Draco Malfoy is willing to talk, but only if it's you." The large man had been sorting through the series of books, gold rings scattered across his swollen hands. Me? Sena hadn't been able to think or comprehend. Single words were all she could manage. She'd been stuck between trying to calm her trembling hands, breathing in the smoke fumes of the office that flowed from the cigar stuck in the corner of his purple lips, and the words he'd casually thrown at her. Draco Malfoy. No one had heard of Draco Malfoy in at least 8 years. Not since the last explosive article that had been done on him by the Prophet. Sena had been too young then to really remember, barely 10 years old. But she knew the history of the most profitable articles of the Prophet, and that the one article on him had been in the top 10 since the end of the Second War. Malfoy had slowly disintegrated from society in the time since the article. All she truly knew was that the Malfoy Manor had closed down, seized by Gringotts, and the last heir had since disappeared. Cuff had let out an annoyed grunt in confirmation. He'd paused and glanced up at her. A look of disapproval crossed his face as he took her in. "As suspected, he still lives," he said, taking his cigar out to blow a smoke halo, "and he's willing to talk." Sena nodded, trying to look as though she had been following along to whatever the man had been saying. She'd still been reeling by the fact that she wasn't going to get fired, at least not at the moment. She cleared her throat. "This is for the piece, The Battle of Hogwarts, 15 years later?" Sena didn't remember the war. Born to Muggle parents, whatever she had learned about the battle had come straight from her Aunt Hera, who had been in her second year at Hogwarts at the time. But it seemed the entire Britain's wizarding world was keen on celebrating the milestone of the battle, now 15 years later. The Daily Prophet has started the trend, promising a full newspaper coverage dedicated to the battle. Rita Skeeter was to write articles on the Golden Trio, along with the tell-all biography of whoever she could get her claws on. The coverage was trusted to senior writers only, not someone like Sena. It had been difficult for her to wrap her mind around the fact that not only did someone want her to write something, but they also wanted it to be on the infamous Draco Malfoy. The Prophet had managed to secure an interview with Ron Weasley, who opened up several more of his successful pub called Red Shot, and Harry Potter, now a head Auror with several successful cases under his belt. There had been no word on Hermione Granger. As far as Sena knew, they had been trying to get a hold of Granger for the past 7 years, but despite the great efforts of trying to find her through her friends and past co-workers, they turned up dead ends every single time. The witch had always been elusive, especially since she'd moved to New York 8 years ago, and the Prophet had continued to try harder every year since. Apparently, there had been a thread of a lead in Australia or New Zealand on her whereabouts and actions a few months ago, but of course, it led to nothing, as predicted. The journalist tasked with scoping out the lead had come back adamant that it was a useless waste of time, despite not remembering where he'd gone or what exactly he'd done there. "Get a hold of yourself, Khan," Cuff snapped, taking in the complete and utter look of confusion on Sena's face. "Parkinson said they'd do it, but only if we send you, so are you in or not?" "In," she immediately answered and straightened up. "Of course I'm in." Cuff had grunted again and flipped through an open newspaper. "Details will be given to you by Parkinson once the confirmation of your agreement is sent to her." Sena had nodded fervently, summoning her notebook out of the parcel with her wand and getting down to writing everything. "Listen to me, Khan. No one's heard from this man for years. You understand how important this is, right? Yes? Good. I need it to be the most explosive thing to come across the paper in years. Enough of the fucking Golden Trio. Malfoy's where the real gold is. We had to hound him down like fucking dogs. I'm not letting go of him now that we've found him. I trust you understand that. I mean, about explosive, correct? Good. Do you need to meet with Skeeter to understand the requirements of such a piece? No? Fine. Close the door behind you when you leave." Sena had scrambled to pull together everything she had known about the second Wizarding World and Draco Malfoy. She knew enough of him now to tremble as she looked up at the house. She was terrified, and not just of what she had been sent out to do. The door to the house opened, and a beautiful petite woman dressed in a tight black dress with blunt dark hair stepped out. From where Sena stood, she could see the clear annoyance across the woman's face. The woman's hand went to her waist. "Are you just going to stand there?" she called out. Sena snapped out of her reverie. She took 1 second to breathe in the ocean-stained air and then paced towards the house. "Sena Khan, I presume?" the woman said. Once Sena made her way up the steps, she looked down at the hand Sena had stuck out to shake hers with enough distaste that she quickly put it back down. "Yes, that's me. I have your letter of invitation," Sena said, showing her the letter she had taken from Cuff. "Pansy Parkinson," she replied, turning to walk inside. "I trust you found us okay." "Actually, it was quite difficult. Do you need an invitation to come in the house, too?" Sena stepped in, feeling the pressure of wards against her body as she did. "No, sorry, thank you. I just want to say that this is a huge opportunity." Pansy stopped midway and turned around. Her feline eyes roved over Sena before she took a deep breath, as if the mere presence of her inside the house troubled her. She flicked her eyes to her perfectly manicured hands before looking back at Sena. "Listen to me very carefully. You have one chance at this. Do you understand that? Just one. Do not fuck this up for everyone involved." Sena nodded. "Yes, of course. I take this very seriously, and I'm very grateful." Parkinson turned around, vanishing into another hallway. "I'm going to go get him and go straight down the hallway and don't touch anything." Sena ran a hand through her hair, stunned at the short encounter. She didn't know much about Pansy Parkinson except that she worked primarily with Zabini Industries as a marketing executive and dabbled in fashion. But she could understand now that she was not a woman to be taken lightly. She made her way down the hallway, taking in the house. It was a small place, a significant downgrade from the Malfoy Manor for sure. If she hadn't known that Draco Malfoy lived here, she wouldn't have believed the house was fit for an aristocrat of Malfoy status. There were slivers of green throughout the house, found in curtains or the carpets, homage to Malfoy's sorting house. There was a distinct smell of mint, and as Sena passed the small kitchen, she saw a floating teapot pouring tea into a cup. The walls of deep red painted hallway in the sitting room that it led to were stacked with books to the ceiling. The sitting room had a couple of mismatched couches and an unlit fireplace that had even more books stacked on its mantel. Books were stacked vertically on the floor around the fireplace, the sofas, and the tables. Unlit candles littered across every elevated surface. She wondered what was chosen by Pansy and what things belonged to Draco. Snuggled tightly between the books on the ground were paintings, elaborate abstracts of dark, moody colors. Sena thought the figures in the paintings looked like the same woman. As Sena walked around the room, there were some books she recognized from her own book collection back home. Others were nonfiction, topics on wizarding history, charms, and potions, and she recognized a first edition of Hogwarts, a history, stacked between a book of potions and a book Sena had once cited in an article called The Complete and Comprehensive Review of the Role of Hogwarts House Elves, Second Wizarding World Edition. She's mostly surprised by some renditions of Muggle authors. Shakespeare, Jane Eyre, Emily Bronte, The Great Gatsby was being shelved to the right of Anna Karenina, all first editions. It was irrational, she knew, considering Malfoy had served his time in Azkaban, but Sena found herself looking for anything that might be considered remotely dark. She found nothing, of course. No grand photos of the Dark Lord, no hidden masks or elaborate torture devices. She knew that the information on the last Malfoy found in books or prophet articles were embellished with fiction, as was the case often. Merlin, much to her own dislike and disagreement, she was tasked to add her own spark to the piece she was going to write. As a journalist, it was her very task to filter through the fiction and write the honest truth, but it was difficult to do so when whatever truth available on the man like Draco Malfoy was simply ugly. The articles on him before and during the war were often in the context of his family and their doings. The articles on him after the war were hardly ever on him directly as to who he was, or more so an amalgamation of the notorious manor parties and continued speculation about his dark past. She peeked outside the single window that looked out into the garden. A single dragonfly hovered near what she recognized as a white daffodils that crept along a white picket fence in a green garden. That explained the other fragrance she smelled. She stood in the middle of the room feeling dazed. She hadn't known what to expect when she was first invited, but it certainly wasn't this. The house was warm, quaint, homey. 3 words that she didn't think anyone ever associated with Draco Malfoy. Death Eater, Wizengamot's greatest mistake, defamed Malfoy hair. Those were words she had seen associated with him. The house was an oxymoron to everything that once represented Malfoy. Yet, Draco Malfoy lived here, and these things belonged to him. This was what the life of a disappeared man looked like. She couldn't help but wonder why now. What made Draco Malfoy agree to an interview after all these years? The world had forgotten about him, so what exactly did he have to say now? She was worried that whatever story he'd come up with would just be fabricated of the real truth. She suspected that one of the reasons why she was even invited was because he knew of her rookie status. Maybe he thought she was desperate enough for a piece that she'd believe everything he said. She was, of course. But there was also a possibility that he believed in the honor of her past work and trusted her enough with the actual truth of what happened. At the end of the day, what choice did she really have other than to hear him out? Sena scratched her eyebrow and glanced down at the table. Her eyes focused on a leather-bound notebook sitting beside an empty mug. The pages inside were crinkled, and the book, which seemed to be bursting at the seams, was tied together by a string. A photograph peeked out of the corner. Curious, she reached down to see what was inside. "I wouldn't touch that if I were you," a cold voice drawled from behind her. Sena's hand snapped back, eyes wide. She turned around to see the source of the voice. Draco Malfoy stood at the entrance of the room. The temperature in the room ran cold and goosebumps pricked her skin. Sena decided at that moment that the photos didn't do the man justice. He was wearing black trousers and a black fitted shirt that made the muscles in his lean frame stand out. His pale white hair, which was long enough to curl behind his ears, was roughly slicked back as if he ran his hands through them in frustration before seeing her. He was ducking his head so that he wouldn't touch the frame of the entrance, and Sena could not stop staring. He was in his 30s now, but except for a shadow of a beard across his lower half and a couple of wrinkles on the corners of his eyes, Draco Malfoy looked as though he hadn't aged a single damn day. Granite-made Greek god. All sharp edges, no smooth undertones. Cold, dark, closed off. And he was glaring at her. "I'm sorry, I was just looking. I really didn't mean to." She was already losing control under his piercing silver eyes. "I told you not to touch anything," Pansy snapped, squeezing through the space between Draco and the wall. "I really am sorry. Sena trailed off when Draco crossed his arms across his chest. His forearm sleeves pulled up slightly, and her eyes fell on the black ink against the dark pale of his skin creeping out of his left sleeve. His eyes narrowed when he followed the movement of her eyes, but he made no move to push the sleeve down. Sena opened her mouth to apologize again, when Pansy stepped in front of her, blocking the view. Pansy glared at her, mouthing, "You're fucking it up. Why don't you sit down, Sena, so we can finally get started?" Sena shut her mouth and nodded gratefully. She was royally screwing this up, and she barely had seen him for 5 minutes. She had to get herself together. Because she really did have this one shot to make it count. She doubted she'd get another piece to write if she screwed up one proper assignment. Her whole career depended on it. Draco moved from where he stood. His eyes followed her as she cleared her throat and took a seat. Every muscle of his body was as tense as a string on a violin bow. One wrong move and he'd snap. As per our agreement, I'm here to write a piece on your thoughts about Hogwarts 15 years later. Sena grasping her bag. "Accio," she whispered, and then her notepad and recording quill came to her. "I work as a journalist at the Prophet." "Is that what they're calling your lot now?" "Draco," Pansy muttered. Sena swallowed and looked at him. "I understand your hesitancy with us. I promise to be honest. For your sake," he said, pushing himself towards the wall and walking towards her. Sena sucked in a breath as he crossed the room in 3 long strides. "I'd hope you were honest about everything. There are many, many ways I can think about how this can affect your career if you chose to continue down this road." "Draco, we've talked about this," Pansy said, exasperated. She squeezed the bridge of her nose and inhaled the short breath. She gave Sena a wide-eyed look as if to say, "See? You see what I have to deal with?" Sena watched Draco sit down on the red suede couch in one motion, every muscle in his body going taut and then relaxing. He looked at her as though he was waiting for a hippogriff to hatch. Silence took over the room, and she squirmed under his piercing gaze. She felt as though everything with Draco Malfoy was a game of owl and mouse, a challenge of sorts, of who would give in first. And naturally, as there wasn't anyone in this world... Are you serious? And naturally, as there probably wasn't anyone in this world who could outwit his game of prey, Sena gave in first. Well, as I said, the prophet is really interested in catching up with all those who were involved in the second Wizarding World War. We just want to know how everyone is doing at this point in their lives, how the war has affected you 15 years later, and your general thoughts and feelings. Really, we just want to get an overall perspective of everyone involved. So, Death Eaters and non-Death Eaters, Draco asked, flexing his hand, and in particular, this Death Eater. Sena's eyes flitted to his long, pale fingers, mesmerized by the movement, before looking at Pansy for help. Pansy simply leaned back in her chair and crossed her legs, a perfectly arched, questioning brow lifted. I'm sorry, that's not what I meant. I know what you meant, Draco cut in, his voice lowering to a deep rumble. He leaned forward, and Sena felt her entire body go rigid. She could see Pansy smirking from the corner of her eyes. Now let me tell you what I want. Sena felt herself faintly nod. She couldn't look away from the mercury pull of his eyes. I want the entire world to stop capitalizing off a fucking war that was fought by children. I want you to fucking relax and stop apologizing because you're here for a reason. I want the prophet to stop making efforts and trying to find me because what I want more than anything is to finally be left alone. He leaned back and his face turned into a neutral mask. He scrubbed his jaw with the back of his hand. So, we're going to sit through this, and I'm going to talk not about the fucking war and my feelings. I'm going to talk, and you're going to listen, because when we're done, you're going to go back to the prophet with your piece so that we can be left alone. Is that clear? The command in his voice made Sena sit up straighter. She charmed her quill and notebook, and they floated beside her hand, ready at her summon. Spine rigid and her hands steady on her lap, she nodded. Where would you like to start? Draco stared at her, trying to see what. Sena wasn't sure. But she schooled her face and tried to convey that she was here to do her job. Honestly. There must have been something he saw, because he gave a short, brisk nod. From the beginning, Draco said. He briefly looked past Sena to the daffodils in the garden, the only sign of hesitancy Sena had seen on the man since she stepped into the house. Something flashed behind his eyes, then the moment disappeared, and his eyes snapped to hers. Ready?